right? Thanking and praising God, if I haven't done it recently, for clarity in a chapter that seems to provide us structurally three stories that have to deal with blindness or a lack of sight. In a chapter where there are three groups of people who have compromised sight, but only one of them actually prays for God to restore their vision. Understanding that, I guess let's just get right into it. Understanding that in the first 16 verses, it's going to have the relatively famous parable of laborers in the vineyard, taking the baton from the last verse of the last chapter that reads, "But many who are first will be last, and the last first." He's going to tell them a parable, literally saying in verse 1, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard." Going back to a theme that we haven't picked up literally since the earlier chapters of Matthew, that being so much of Matthew is devoted to giving us a better understanding of the kingdom of heaven, sometimes referred to as the kingdom of God. Those two aren't necessarily synonymous, but it takes a much longer study than what I have time to devote right now to the topic. And so let's just move it on and understand those are two words that are developed throughout Matthew's gospel and to a degree throughout the rest of the gospels as well. That's all an aside to say that this insight into the kingdom talks about the way in which that master of the vineyard goes out in waves to hire workers throughout the day. As he finds them waiting around, he hires them and brings them into his employ without necessarily knowing beyond that first wave what they're going to be paid. Understanding that by the time he gets to paying them out, he pays those he hired last, first, and basically gives them the same wage for the day that he gave those he agreed to go into the vineyard first, creating a problem. Those who were hired first acknowledge that they bore the heat of the day, but they're getting the same wage, and it doesn't seem fair, and they have no problem expressing that to the owner or the master of the vineyard, to which he replies, "You got what you bargained for, but that doesn't control what I am at liberty to pay everyone else." And because he paid everyone the same wage for different hours of work that day, he simply tells them, don't begrudge his generosity. One thing to note, though, as you study this parable is it talks about a day, not a contract of employment for any time or period of work beyond a day. So understand that this does not say that if those workers who showed up at the end of the day decided that they're going to show up at the end of the day every day, that they're going to get a day's wage. But for this particular day, he seems to have had sympathy for the fact that, as it's literally going to say, no one hired them throughout the day. And understanding other stories or parables that talk about, really not stories, but the portions of the law that talk about give a day laborer their wages at the end of the day, understanding that they need them. His sympathies might have acknowledged the fact that their willingness to work should not have been rewarded any less than those who found the opportunity first. Understanding that, he in verse 4 is going to say to that second wave of workers, go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right, I will give you. And so understanding that, this is one of those passages that measures in some ways our level of trust for God and his fairness. Understanding that, anchored at least in that verse, what he's doing isn't necessarily unfair as much as it may be a sign of his mercies. Understanding that, it leads into Jesus foretelling his death again. And if we have any questions about God's fairness, understand that the Christ is foretelling his death having never sinned. And so it's not fair that his son should have to die in order to save those of us who have. But there is something in the mercy of that act that really takes the baton from that parable, where what God does sometimes to us might seem to be unfair because our perspective is just much more narrow. And he does not begrudge our narrow perspective to the degree we avoid the temptation to pass judgment on him, understanding that he just has a different viewpoint than we do. But understanding that viewpoint, one of the more shocking parables in the chapter comes when Jesus, having prophesied his death for, is this the third time? Yeah, I think the third time now, is going to have the mother of James and John come up to him and ask him to let her sons sit on his right and his left in his kingdom. And it almost comes off like, even though we don't have the timing here, somebody basically saying they're about to die and then coming up and asking you for your stuff right after that conversation. It just seems, as we sometimes hear today, tone deaf. But we don't know what she knew going into the request. We just know that he is going to gently tell them that they need to shift their focus, because once again, the famous lesson from this parable reads around about verse 26, midway through: whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, seeming to redirect them back to what he, at least in the sequence of events here, had just told them. He's about to die, and they're asking for stuff. What they really asked is for the kind of accountability that goes with the reward that they want. If they want his privilege, they're going to have to take on his responsibilities. Like we say, you can't put the crown before the cross. The cross comes before the crown, and they are so fixated on sitting next to or adjacent to the crown that they don't really understand that what they've just asked for is a whole lot of suffering. Going on, though, the last parable or the last story is going to talk about Jesus healing two blind men from verses 29 on through verse 24, these seeming to be the ones who actually might have the best perspective, understanding that he does heal those blind men. The chapter in verse 34 concluding by saying, in pity, he healed them or touched their eyes, healing them. It makes it seem as though the only ones who really understood what they should have been asking for were those men who were physically blind. Understanding that the first section of the chapter, as we have broken it down, talks about the way in which the blind assumptions of those who started off the day in the vineyard led to their disappointment, fixated on what they saw as justice, leaving out the considerations that go to mercy, and the fact that the injustice they perceived as being done to themselves is nothing compared to the injustice done to the landowner's son, the injustice that actually provides them access to that job in the first place, reminding us of the whole concept of discipleship. If Christ has a cross to pick up, as he has talked about in previous chapters, we have one to pick up too. And sometimes I am disappointed in life when I look at it from the perspective of my rights as opposed to my responsibility to likewise pay forward the mercy shown to me. Going on in that second section, that's exactly what Jesus demonstrates in prophesying his death the third time, only to show us the blind ambition of two of his disciples, which I think will eventually be known as apostles, when their mother comes to ask for their promotion to an exalted position in the kingdom, blinded to the actual responsibilities and sacrifices that go along with the job they seek, leading to the two blind men, understanding that nobody else in any of these stories or parables asks for their sight to be restored, other than the ones who were so lacking that it was obvious they needed some help. In a chapter that quite possibly reminds us, if nobody else reminds me, of why Paul wrote, when I am weak, then I am strong, when he talked about his own personal weaknesses, or specifically, I think, his thorn in the flesh, the very thing that kept him humble enough to realize the degree to which he needed God to open his eyes even further to the reality around him, no matter how great a revelation God had made to him in the past, which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. Not that we have to suffer so much that we beg God to continue to open our eyes to the things that we are just missing around us, but that God willing, we grow to a point where it no longer takes suffering for us to beg God to open our eyes so that we can truly see.